Bonjour à tous.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this roundtable. We're very happy to welcome you here. We're going to talk about one of the hot spots of the tech planet, Southeast Asia, a region which deserves being known, very innovative, young, connected, a lot of success stories to talk about innovation, progress, and diversity. Some inequalities, so Southeast Asia, a land of opportunity or a mirage. So we'll ask the question to our panelists of this session. I will introduce them to you, starting from the right, Mingpo CAI, who's president and founder of Cathay Capital, investment fund and venture capital. European investment fund that invests everywhere worldwide, notably in Southeast Asia. Sandiaga Uno, former Minister of Tourism in Indonesia, a very important businessman around Jakarta. And then you have Arnaud, President of International SOS, also the member of MEDEF International, and he will talk about this region. And Ravindra and founder of the Asian Network, a business network in the Southeast Asia region. But first, the floor is to Mary-Françoise, an economist specialist of development, notably in Asia. We'll go back on Southeast Asia later as a political and economic entity. So how was the Asian developed? Thank you. Thank you. I think that to better understand the development of these Southeast Asian countries, you must remember that when Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Singapore, of course, founded the ASEAN in 1967. It was during the Cold War, and their first objective was to limit the expansion of communism. So the objective was, first and foremost, political, and to stabilize the zone and enable economic development. So countries that for most were quite poor countries. And the question that rose was to find out if it was a community in a list of countries that are very different in terms of history, in terms of development, political regime. And we see that over a few years, the objective was to support the national identity to manage to develop a community. So the objective is complex, difficult. It was partially achieved. One of the major events, can't talk about the different steps, so I have no time for that, but it's the creation through the initiative in Indonesia of the RCEP, this treaty of free trade that gave a pivotal role to the Asian countries. And so there are two phenomena that fostered the integration of ASEAN. The first of these phenomena was the Plaza Agreements in 1985, which decided on a re-evaluation of the Japanese yen, which affected the competitiveness of Japanese companies. The government, in a commercial war with the U.S., decided to improve the added value of its production and asked its corporations, companies that were relocalized in Malaysia and neighboring countries to reorient their production toward exports rather than serving the national market. So we had the first step towards an integration through direct FDIs in the region. The same thing happened during the re-evaluation of the South Korean currency and Taiwan currency. The second event was the opening up of China and its economic model. As you know, this opening was founded on the creation of a specific economic zone on growth and the growth of FDIs. The development of FDIs. So at the beginning, more than 90% of FDIs in China came from Asian countries, Southeast Asian countries, thanks to the Chinese diaspora. And as of 2005, same phenomenon was observed. The government decided to improve the quality of growth, its growth. So the renminbi was devaluated, which of course impacted on the competitiveness of companies. And we had the first waves of relocalization in Bangladesh, Cambodia, Vietnam, so on and so forth. What these countries share in common is to consider that development must be founded on industrialization, and they will adopt the model, most of them, the goose model defined by a Japanese economist. It's a development that will concern poor countries, often agricultural countries, which start by importing low technology content products. Then they will transform them and export them, and with the income improve their own production level, their own technology, and so delocalize in poor countries. And this model was followed by most of the countries. So they will rely for this on developing states, that is, strategic countries that will implement an industrial strategy based on institutions that they control. Countries who are responsible for the development of these countries. So they work on the long run. They rely on planning, they rely on development agencies and special policies, so exchange rates, tax breaks to attract foreign investments in special economic zones, and also subsidies for export. So I have no time to develop all this, but there are some very original approaches that were implemented in these Asian countries with a common ruling, that is, we control the efficiency of these subsidies, and they grant subsidies first and foremost to companies that prove to be capable of exporting. The other common element is the recognition of the pivotal role of education. Very large investments in education, vocational training, R&D, but also the protection of copyright, of copywriting. So they have skilled labor, and it was much easier to adopt the new technologies. The best known example is the fintech in Singapore, that is now the fourth financial market worldwide, behind London, New York, and Hong Kong. And most of the larger cities in Southeast Asia saw their innovation index rise in recent years. Most of these countries have managed to create an environment that is very favorable to innovation. For example, the creation of startups and artificial intelligence, digital economy, and so on and so forth. And this integration was considered as a success. And so they created integrated circuits first for electric vehicles, for example. Ore came from Indonesia and the Philippines, iron ore, and batteries came from Malaysia and other countries, semiconductors from yet other Asian countries. And so there's an economic integration that is carried out in the production chain. So we can see a remarkable result in the adoption of these new technologies, whether the digital economy, smart cities, and what have you. And so the limit is that there's a strong dependency to foreign innovation. Now, obviously, Vietnam exports high technology goods, but it's a foreign technology, imported technology. The telephones exported by Vietnam in the US are manufactured by Samsung, and they're not a Vietnamese innovation. And so there is this restriction, this limit, as well as the financing of infrastructure, which is phenomenal in Indonesia, Vietnam, and it's a key element for the economic development. But this financing is mostly Chinese, and it depends on Chinese investments. Today we can note that the implementation of the Trump tax rulings had a big impact. The Prime Minister of Indonesia reminded a few days ago that we needed to have a common response to that. It's very difficult because some countries like Vietnam, for example, thought that it would have a better capacity to negotiate with Trump. We know the bamboo diplomacy of Vietnam, which tries to negotiate with everybody. But today it's an objective that is a bit difficult to reach in these negotiations. We can draw a learning from all this, is that contrarily to what international institutions recommended, is that we consider that we can observe that the industrialization supported by a strategic state with a modern planning and a very high level of education can allow a poor country to improve the standard of living of its population and pull out most of its population from poverty and become an innovative economy. Faced to this, we can conclude raise a question is that in the context where these countries try to diversify their commercial partners to limit risks, what should be the strategy of Europe and what can be the place of Europe in this part of the world? Thank you, Mary-Françoise, for this brilliant presentation. Thanks. The floor is now to Ravindra Ngo. You were from Cambodia, founder of a think tank. Who are the actors who are moving in Southeast Asia? Can you do a mapping of the situation? First of all, thank you to the Rencontre économique d'Aix-en-Provence for inviting me here. I was born a few hours from here. I was born in Antibes. Reminds me of my childhood. So thank you for being here today to this session. So just to give you, before going into the mapping, as Aude said, of the Southeast Asia, a map of Southeast Asia, the IMF has observed the growth trend to 3.9%. So they lowered the trend due to the economical and geopolitical context. But Southeast Asia remains a very attractive zone. In fact, in market size, we count about 670 million inhabitants for medium age level of 31 years old, so great growth and demographic potential. So I will now try to structure my paper, my presentation. I will focus on three axes. First of all is to better understand why the Southeast Asia zone is an attractive zone. Well, first of all, the demography and economic trends. We have an ecosystem that is very favorable for this. In Southeast Asia, we have about 50 unicorns. One who is extremely important. We have someone from Indonesia, which is called Bujek. I think they have a valorization at $10 billion or euros. And Kajek is a startup specialized in transport and mobile payments, the equivalent of Grab and in other Southeast Asian zones. So it's an example. And the demography, as I said in my introduction, with a median age of 31 years, so very young population. In terms of demography, great potential. And also we have hubs, centers in Southeast Asia like Singapore, Jakarta, Ho Chi Minh City, which are attracting young talents today, not only in Southeast Asia, but also from Europe and other continents. So this is also a very strong trend for Southeast Asia. And also, I think that the sector or sectors, the important sectors in terms of technology are fortunately the fintechs. We also have agritech and restech. I think that later a lot of investors are focusing on these sectors. So this is the first point. Secondly, it's the support, government support, but also of conglomerates that we call the GAFAMs, Amazon, Google, which are not relocalizing, but in fact they are setting up their subsidiaries in Southeast Asia. And so this, of course, attracts new talents. It gives a better visibility on a zone, an emerging zone. And also at the government level, we have several recommendations or setting up of political rules. With the example of Singapore, they try to ensure what they call the Vision 2023, which is called the Smart Nation. They try to benefit to the population with the implantation of tools, digital tools in the tech world that has very strong impact on the well-being of the population. We have the example of Thailand also. Thailand is one of the specificity of the Thailand population is that 15% of the population is over 65. So everything dealing with the silver economy, for this population, aging population, while the Thai government obviously is very much interested in this age group and is setting up quite a lot of programs as far as infrastructure. The development of the smart city also is very much involved in that. And I think, lastly, that along these axes, the third one, and you saw in the different leaflets of this event, there is a strong investment on the pillar of AI. AI, generative or predictive AI, we see in the field of health, also, but for the environment, I think they've planned the weather forecast, I say 40 degrees today, where there's one heat wave peak that is expected today. In fact, this revolution of AI will enable to predict the trends, scenarios, and anticipate the major risks we should expect ecologically, but also at the level of our health. And since this is a trend I'm observing in Southeast Asia. And on top of all this, I think the opportunities that it facilitates or it fosters is inclusion. There's one of the specificities of the region of Southeast Asia is that you have a lot of disparities. Disparities of population. Indonesia, more than 270 million inhabitants, I think. So, and in Brunei, 480,000 inhabitants, I think so. And so, economically speaking, I think Singapore is $28,000 of GDP per inhabitant, compared to Myanmar, I think it's $1,700 US. So major disparities. Another difference in Southeast Asia or disparity is the proportion of the rural populations and urban populations. So the AI, fintech, finance and technology will probably remediate this fragmentation and differences. It will sort of smoothen the disparities. Besides the strengths, we also talk about weaknesses in terms of technological innovation. There are several, but I can maybe mention a few. The first is the protection of data protection. In fact, there's also another major stake. This is covered in the media often. It's everything related to the cities, countries in Southeast Asia, such as Thailand, Myanmar, and Cambodia, where you have a lot of cyber scam presence, a lot of cybersecurity issues, I think, exploitation of data. This is a major issue. And as I said, it's also the disparity as far as digital infrastructure that we can find. So the situation is very different. For example, in Singapore, the rate of internet covering is maximum, but if you go to the rural areas in the provinces of Cambodia or others, there we lack a lot of coverage or digital infrastructure. So this is very mapping in a nutshell of the situation. I think the vision of ASEAN, as you said, is a vision. ASEAN, for the moment, is located in Malaysia. They talk about a vision 2050, aiming at strengthening this axis of digital transformation, which in fact is valued quite a lot at $230 billion in 2026, valorized. But the other idea is to capitalize on R&D, and they also want to ensure the development for a creative economy. So this is in a nutshell what I wanted to say. Thank you. Floor is Arnaud VAISSIÉ.
Macron.
So you were with Emmanuel Macron last month when he went to Southeast Asia, particularly when he was in Singapore and Indonesia. And what struck you when you were there? What was the best practice that you identified? Not the slap when he got off the plane, but something else that you saw when you were there. Yes, there were two economic delegations that were with President Macron when he went to Singapore and Southeast Asia, and there were several economic agreements that were signed in Indonesia and in Singapore between French companies and Indonesians and Singaporeans. What's very interesting for us is that there's a real appetite in Indonesia and even more in Singapore for French interests, French companies, and the French economy. What was said on ASEAN is, I share that, but you can't forget the importance of China, which is the lungs, which has been having an impact. Traditionally, it was the United States that was driving these countries, but now China is an essential player in this region. So all the ASEAN countries, particularly Singapore, would like to establish a balance, and Europe is a natural partner to try to balance this very conflictual relationship between the US and China and the ASEAN countries that are between the two that have to stay friends with China because they're a huge power in the region, and they will remain so. And the US, which was traditionally the protector of these countries against communism. So what we saw were significant economic agreements. In Singapore, 20 agreements were signed. And what's interesting is that out of the 20, 15, the 3/4 concerned tech and innovation. For example, a national program for robotics in Singapore and the CNRS together to create a new institute, a new ecosystem that would work on robotics and artificial intelligence. Or Thales, with the Economic Development Board, they're creating their 4th artificial intelligence center. So these agreements have a significant scope, but I would like to come back to what I said earlier. Singapore is an example of an economy managed French style, but why are the results different? That's what's interesting. GDP per inhabitant is top in the world of all the developed countries, at the same level as Switzerland, 115,000 Singaporean dollars, 85,000 euros roughly, so very high. When I went to Singapore in '85 and I spent 14 years there, Singapore was still a poor country. In 60 years, they went from a very poor country without resources to one of the richest one in the world, with a very French system, with powerful public service, with brilliant people that manage the economy. So what is the difference with France? The difference is the Economic Development Board, which is the orchestra leader of the Singapore economy, is very interesting in this field, 850 people, a small organization, but one that works on long-term plans, 5-year plans, like the French used to do. And these 5-year plans focus on 3 words: research, innovation, and commercialization. They get funding for 5 years, and if after 4 years, when the funding is to be renewed, if they cannot show that the plan will lead to commercialization, they drop it and move on to something else. The second element is that everything is done for development not to go through the public sector, but rather the private sector. The private sector in Singapore, there are state companies, private companies, and foreign investors. Singapore is the number 4 recipient of foreign investment across the world, but they only have a population of 6 million people. Their proportion is quite extravagant. Another obsession in Singapore is to maintain the proportion of manufacturing industry. They have the highest revenue in the world, so high costs, but nevertheless they maintain 22% of PNB, GNP, which is already substantial, and they want to increase it. There's something that they do that's very different than what we do. This Economic Development Board is looking constantly at sectors of the future, and they let go of the ones that have reached the summit of the growth curve. An example, which is an old one but is very telling, in the 1990s they had 50% of the production of hard drives in the world. 50% was produced in Singapore, and the EDB decided that this industry had no growth prospects anymore. So they pushed all of these companies that were producing hard drives to Malaysia. They pushed all of the investment and the promotion of Singapore to semiconductors. And this is something that they do all the time. They change sectors very quickly and regularly, and they abandon other ones. This strength, this ability to identify the sectors of the future and giving up on those sectors of the past. Let me tell you another interesting point about Singapore. The de Gaulle or Churchill of Singapore had identified that China was going to become a great power. This was in 1990. China was just beginning to open up in the early 1980s. And for this, he decided that the population of Singapore, where he had bet on English, now had to learn Mandarin. And any Singaporean of Chinese origin in Singapore, so 72% of the population, overnight could go into university if they could be bilingual in Mandarin. And now the Chinese of Singapore are trilingual. English, they speak English and Mandarin. So this ability to project to the future and to ferociously invest in the future is one of their recipes for success. There's AI. They call themselves a smart nation. They identified this 15 years ago. A smart nation allows all of the Indonesian, Singaporean population, Singaporean companies to learn AI in their education system, to use it, including the silver economy in Singapore, because they have a demographic problem with population aging. So they all know how to use AI in everyday life. Thank you for this presentation. Arnaud, I'm going to pass the floor to the Minister Inigo. So the innovations, do they meet the societal challenges, and what is still left to do in this field? So you're going to speak in English.
Thank you for having me on this conference. And I was recently toured the Southeast Asia. It's 10 countries from Myanmar, Cambodia, went to Vietnam, also to Thailand, obviously Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia. And if you look at the Southeast Asia region, you will see obviously Singapore on the top of the GDP per capita, but you also have challenges. You cannot look Southeast Asia with one sort of like view and perspectives, but Southeast Asia is very, very diverse and very unique. And the most important thing, it's rising. The economic growth is increasing, and Indonesia, being half of Southeast Asia in terms of populations, in terms of the economy, really is now shaping up under our new president. Our new president loves France, and I think Arnaud experienced both President Macron and President Prabowo do a karaoke sing for 20 minutes. and they sing French song. In fact, when I used to help Prabhu develop the economic platform of his party, he would spend, I think, few weeks of a year here in Paris. He speaks the language. And I think when I ran with him at the 2019 presidential elections, I learned that we have so much potential, not just Indonesia, but as regions as a whole. And I would like to touch on what would drive Southeast Asia and how we could collaborate. First is the innovations. It is a very, very innovative region. But secondly, that is very important, is it is a very, very adaptive. We quickly adapt. You mentioned about Singapore adaptations. We adapt to democracy not too long ago, about 25 years ago, on a full-fledged democracy. And we do it with collaborative measures, as ASEAN was started in 1967. So it is not just about high tech, but high touch. With very diverse culture, Southeast Asia is meeting local wisdom with global ideas. I also would like to say that the innovations is the grassroots innovations. It's not just the high-tech, the rocket science, AI, robotics, but it is something that we do every day, like agricultural, fishery. You mentioned about Gojek, but there are other innovations, like there is a InsurTech company that collects your Garmin data now in Indonesia to translate into a very unique premium base on your health. So if you exercise more, you pay less premium for your insurance. So there are many of this coming up in Southeast Asia. So we just don't need unicorns. We have 50 unicorns, but we have an ability to create sociopreneurs, social entrepreneurs. Secondly, it is about the SMEs. Many agreements were struck during President Macron's visits to Southeast Asia, but the one that will drive the growth and the economic integrations would be the 64 million SMEs in Indonesia, plus other SMEs that drive more than 60% of the GDP and create good quality jobs. Around 90% of the jobs are created by the SMEs. So if you want to look at Southeast Asia, look at the SME sectors. From the coffee stall in Cambodia to, I would say, fashion designer in Indonesia, all the way to the craftsman in Thailand. If you watch The White Lotus, where Thailand was able to create this very innovative way of Netflix blockbusters, tourism, but also creative economy. And it is a high-tech that everyday's use. We use it on everyday's life, and it touches lives. So I was able to, during my years in the public life, created a couple of movements, the SME movements that create close to 600,000 jobs, and also an innovations and technology movement that handles some of these grassroots innovations that's now seeing from the Golden Village to Tourism Village program. And I believe that we in ASEAN will be not just taking care of the borders, but we're building bridges. And it is an innovation bridges that connect Singapore to some of the most challenging regions within the Southeast Asia. And Indonesia have great program, like shifting some of the inefficiency of the government budget to the free nutritious meal that you talk about, Arnaud. It's going to open up a lot of opportunity for SMEs, in particular within the food and energy sector. So finally, I want to close to a call to actions to everybody. So let's create these collaborations within Southeast Asia and Europe, in particular French. And it is going to be based on value-driven innovations that would be meaningful to the people and create prosperity together. Thank you very much.
Merci, Monsieur le Ministre.
Thank you, Minister. It's now, Mingpo CAI, you're the founder of the Cathay Capital Investment Fund. It's a fund that invests across the world. You would like to tell us about how you understand projects, how you decide to invest in Southeast Asia. Do you say that it's because the markets are huge or very populated, or it's because the population is very young, very connected, very captive, if you like? We see opportunities everywhere. Cathay manages $5 billion in our fund, and we opened an office in Singapore 10 years ago. I come from Fujian, from a in all the big industrial families in Southeast Asia, we speak the same dialect. I'm delighted to see you here. If I talk about Southeast Asia, the Pacific region, we have several big companies involved in fintech. It's one of the biggest fintech companies in Southeast Asia. Financed has made banks more democratic, more accessible. We're listed on the NASDAQ. Cham is certainly a pioneer and an example of a financial company, one that we made accessible to make banking activity possible to the highest number of people. As a financial company that serves its country, but also does it across the world, starting with Indonesia. We invested in a company called Rubello to recycle telephones and for household goods. This company is based in Southeast Asia, but they exported the model to the United States. And I went with them to San Francisco, and they've become a leading company in the United States now. And there's also a company that's made insurance more accessible to the populations. So tech is great, but it's better to apply tech. Applications give solutions for the highest number in the population. So financing the founder, Maclin, in India, in Indonesia. The founder of Rebello is a French person, a bit Singaporean, and have lived in Southeast Asia for a long time. So what am I trying to say here? Today, we're talking a lot about Southeast Asia. I was joking with Hervé Lorenzi. We're not talking about China, we're talking about Southeast Asia. Are you doing this seriously or not, I said. I agree. In the past, we were only talking about Asia. We talked about the Far East. You can't include China anymore. It's too big. So we're calling it Southeast Asia. But there's a long list of companies, a long list of countries in this region. Technology must make it possible for us to unite and to create bridges. You're right. We are building bridges today. So without talking about China or the US, we have to look at both of them. We can't oppose them. How many Chinese tech companies are in Southeast Asia? And we also have to understand that the market is very important in the United States because they're behind our startups. I think that economies need to stay connected. If we don't build bridges, we can build tunnels. We're creating a connection, and I know the people in person. And I'm not just talking about systems. And today, the talents and the depth of the Southeast Asian economy linked to this opening. There are many Chinese people who are here, and not only Chinese people, there are lots of Americans and Indians who are meeting. Is the market deep now? I say not deep enough yet. The market is still in its early stages.
So it's a big mistake. The Southeast Asia, they follow their own path. They embrace AI and tech. But what I recommend is that we should concentrate on applications and the final usage of all this. And it should be for the masses and not to recreate or to supply the ultra-rich as we experience whether in the United States or China. I'm for the application of tech applications, and I developed a lot of activity in China. We have almost 2 billion euros creating vertical funds in China, very specific to curb the issue. It's useless to tell good stories if we don't solve the problems. So I think that in Southeast Asia we have to identify the problems, mobilize talent, mobilize resources, whether local, Chinese, American, or all over the planet. If it's human intelligence, well, it should serve a good cause. Human intelligence has to serve a good cause. I think that's my vision. Thank you. So we will react with the rest of the panel. A subsidiary question, Mingpo, because you talked about the links of Southeast Asia with China, with what's happening in a world that is more and more fractured. Can Southeast Asia find its independence towards China? Can you break the ties? I don't know why we want to split up the people. Well, you know, we're all together here on this table. No, it's not a good idea to break ties. Sometimes China makes us afraid. It's because we don't understand China. The Chinese are innocent, like the French, like the U.S. And why does China move so fast, especially in AI? Well, they have an exceptional quality of data. You have a very digital economy in China. So they have a database, a quality of data. And it's like our body. When they eat good food, if you have good ingredients, you digest fast. Instead of taking 24 hours to digest, well, every 8 hours you digest. So if you eat good data, it's the same, and your body becomes stronger, and your intelligence is sharper. And when you are obsessed for usefulness and practical applications, well, you see in France you have new trades that have appeared, new jobs in batteries and electric cars and what have you. So we shouldn't sanction the people who do better, but we need to collaborate. And in Indonesia, they gave the example to attract the industrialists of the world over, including Chinese, to come and set their companies locally. So what should we ask the Chinese? This is a secret I want to share with you. There's a secret. China, 30 years ago when they opened up, they called the Western world to come to China, do the technological transfer, set up their companies industrially. Well, do the same. The Chinese had a good understanding of the situation, whether in France or Southeast Asia. You know, you have to do the same. At Cathay, we're very present in Europe. We have 4 representations, 4 offices in Paris, Germany, Spain. And for a long time also, we're at ATAM in Africa. We have a partnership with local partners there. And I think that a company like Cathay, we're very deep-rooted. I'm from Aix. You know, welcome here. This is my home. And the root has to be deep. The roots have to be deep. And we have to be there to contribute to the ecosystem. If I came to Aix, it's not to water my plants and everything. The land won't like that. I think that we have to establish ties together, relationships. We're like 6 trees here around this table. If we have the common roots, we're all connected, and then we're a real platform, we're a force, we're a solution. Thank you, Mingpo. Ravindra, would you like to react on this geopolitical aspect? You, who talk with these business people in the region, do you see them as being increasingly interested by the U.S. or frightened what's happening? How do they react? Well, thank you for this question. First of all, I go along with what Mingpo said. We're all connected through differences in Asia culturally, the disparities, differences I mentioned earlier. I think, in fact, if we have the will to do the right things in the tech, invest on social platforms and things, I think it's a common vision we should all have in the region. But to respond to your question, reply to your question, I think that in the Southeast Asian region, I don't like to say battles, but to use the word battles, but there's a rivalry between the powerful China and the U.S. And there is a geostrategic interest of the Indo-Pacific zone outside of the Southeast Asian zone, Indo-Pacific zone, which is growing. And so I think recently the visit of Emmanuel Macron, the French president, in Indonesia, and then in Vietnam, and he ended at one of the largest summit in Shangri-La, Singapore, defense summit in Asia, the largest, the most important summit in Asia. So that's an indicator. And then what choices should investors, business leaders turn to? Well, that's difficult question to address because there are some countries of Southeast Asia which are very strongly tied to China, have strong relationships with China. It's the case of Cambodia. We can mention Laos and Myanmar, and some that are more towards the U.S., like the Philippines, Indonesia, Singapore, but others who are more on the neutral side and who have a good understanding of the chessboard, making reference to the book by Brzezinski, with a view to this strategic positioning. I think that if we consider, I think that today's session is on Southeast Asia, but I would like to eventually bring some fuel for thought, what we can learn from each other. The EU and ASEAN and the EU. I think Sandiaga mentioned this. Sandiaga mentioned the fact that Europe can learn from agility, the efficiency and resilience of Southeast Asia. Can learn on that. We see this because of the U.S. leadership with the tariffs, for example, custom tariffs. China and ASEAN had to strengthen their ties, notably with a partnership that already exists, the ASEAN +3, bring together ASEAN, China, and South Korea and Japan. But also recently during a summit, ASEAN, China, and the Gulf countries also strengthened their ties and form new alliances. So I think it's it's an opportunity stemmed by this crisis. And I think that what we can learn, Southeast Asia, ASEAN, and EU, what we can learn from all this is that the EU has set up a lot of initiatives and on environmental issues. That's the first aspect. The second point that Southeast Asia could learn from Europe is a lot on ethical regulation. I think you published the AI Policy Act, so that's a good example. Last question before handing over the floor to microphone to the floor. We talked about societal stakes. Is the environmental stake important in Southeast Asia? I think we've regressed on the environment. Is that something that is a concern in Indonesia, environmental aspects, environmental issues?
And I think Indonesia, and in particular Southeast Asia in general, is the epicentrum when you talk about green economies, there's so much opportunity that we could work together, be it from the tropical rainforest to mangrove, to coral reefs restorations. We have a lot of potentials to bring in AI and the tech sectors to the green economy, not just agricultural and marine, but the entire ecosystem. I invested in a company that basically handle food loss and food waste. That would address around 30% less on carbon emissions. We're also looking at innovations that respond to climate change. I mean, we're in a heat wave right now, but in Indonesia, it's really, really hot also. So Southeast Asia, not only hot, but humid. And therefore, it is something that innovations needs to address the green challenges, food insecurity, and youth unemployment. Now, you guys probably watch the movie Crazy Rich Asia. Crazy Rich Asian is actually very misleading because most Southeast Asian is very frugal and very family friendly, very focused on circular economies. So I think there's a lot of works that could be done in that area. And I think within the next few years, there's an opening up of huge opportunities for us to create a shared solutions for green economy.
Merci, on va prendre quelques questions dans la salle. Il y a quelques minutes, tout devant, peut-être monsieur.
Questions from the floor. Sir, can you stand up and take a microphone, please? Just so we understand what you're saying, we hear what you're saying. So may I address my question in English or should I address in French for the minister?
Thank you. Raphael Salmian, based in Singapore in the semiconductor industry. I think I agree with you. Indonesia is very fascinating with the population, but I'd like your opinion as a government representative on two items. Number one, young population, but there is challenges in finding talented, and education is a big issue across the region, but more particularly in Indonesia. Second, the fragmentation of ASEAN, I think is an opportunity, but also a challenge. What's your view on creating a more homogeneous bloc, like eventually the European Union, to be in the middle of the power, economic power between China and United States? Thank you.
Thank you. Youth unemployment is a very serious issue because we not only not able to produce jobs in general, but not being able to focus on the good quality jobs that adapt to the latest of technology. So I think this is where PPP, public-private partnership, needs to be in place to not only upskill, reskill, and new skill the young populations. In Indonesia, we have a few of that initiatives, and I think Singapore has great examples over there. And I think, silver economies is a $15 trillion potential opportunities, but the young unemployment needs to be addressed, and I agree with you, we need to move fast on this one. Secondly, I would say within the Southeast Asia sectors, not only technology, but also health and educations are great opportunities. And my opinion is, yes, we have challenges. The fragmentations is a challenge. I tried to create a Southeast Asia airline. It failed, although I invested together with Singapore Airlines. But I think there are models that work, like AirAsia, like DBS Bank is across Southeast Asia, and CIMB out of Malaysia. But we cannot create a homogeneous platform across Southeast Asia. Each countries would have local wisdoms and local strengths and weaknesses. And therefore, we need to integrate the economies and maybe,
Monsieur Sandiaga,
maybe produce the best from each country.
Je vais laisser le mot de la fin pour conclure à Mary-Françoise Renard.
Concluding words to Mary-Françoise Renard to conclude this roundtable very in a nutshell. Just to remind you that in these systems in which institutions controlled by the state, as it was underlined by Arnaud, were very efficient, but they were accompanied by a lot of competition between private corporations and public corporations, startups and others. But it doesn't stop competition. And the second point, I have 30 seconds, I'd like to go back on what was said on the importance of applications, the application of new technology to the whole of the population. Innovation should not lead to a fragmentation of the population between those who benefit from this innovation and others that are left aside or are the weakest. On the contrary, innovation should serve the whole of the population massively. And often the countries of Southeast Asia have better understood this than we have. So thank you, and be careful of the digital divide also. Thank you to all our speakers. I think hope you learned things during this session. Thank you.